Jordan Peterson is a man who has for the last couple of years risen to the top of online discourse for many arguably problematic reasons. To many of his critics, Peterson is the accumulation of toxic culture brought about by fundamentalist groups attempting to cling on to power for a little longer, whilst it seems that many of his fans revere him as almost a prophetic figure come to end the social justice madness once and for all. And whilst I've generally steered clear of the sorts of communities Peterson is hailed in, you the audience spoke, and so it's time for a change. Today's video comes from Peterson's Big Think appearance titled The Fatal Flaw in Leftist American Politics, and whilst I must declare for those who may not yet realise, I am not an American, the age of connectivity has dissolved barriers of communication to such an extent that I feel assured enough to give my views on various points made by Peterson, starting with who exactly he means by the vaguely termed leftists. The first problem I notice with the way Peterson presents his arguments is the way in which he doesn't seem to be able to pick a target and stick with it. Since the title just states leftist, I was happy to see Peterson give us specifics as to who he was discussing in the introduction of his video, the supposed target being postmodernism.
The fundamental claim of postmodernism is something like an infinite number of interpretations and no canonical overarching narrative.
And I thought, great, that gives everything he's about to say context that makes it worth discussing. So far, so good. The problem is that he backtracks almost immediately with this little nugget.
They default to this kind of, this loose egalitarian Marxism.
Indeed, the phrase is very loosely defined, being given no sort of definition by Peterson himself. This seems to be a cheap substitution for the now tainted cultural Marxist, which, while said phrase had its origins during the Red Scare, it subsequently dropped out of popular usage and was later picked up once again by Nazi circles looking to draw in support. Peterson's use of the similarly termed egalitarian Marxist seems to simply be the latest in a long line of ever-evolving right-wing words, creating the ominous other. Indeed, Peterson pulls out many of the same claims often launched against cultural Marxism surrounding educational establishments and left-wing activism in general.
The activism is mostly the Marxism rather than the postmodernism. It's more like an intellectual gloss to hide the fact that a discredited economic theory is being used to fuel an educational movement and to produce activists.
Yeah, what's funny is that he doesn't stop there. A mere minute later and Peterson has already once again changed his target.
The French intellectuals in particular just pulled off a sleight of hand and transformed Marxism into postmodern identity politics. And we've seen the consequence of that. It's not good. It's a devolution into a kind of tribalism that will tear us apart on the right and on the left and on the right.
So we started out with leftist, which was specified to postmodernism, which was then shifted to egalitarian Marxist, which was then broadened out to the source of left-wing activism in general, which was once more changed to niche identity politics. Where will Mr. Peterson go next?
And I think that's a colossal ethical failure, and it may doom the liberal left project.
Of course, direct from niche identity politics back to broad party politics. At this point, it may be easier for Peterson to tell us who he isn't talking about. Or indeed, he could just stick with focusing on the left as a whole, rather than specifying a certain group and then repeatedly substituting said group for an entirely different group for seemingly no other reason than ticking all the boxes in right-wing bingo. Peterson's indecisive nature in failing to pick a target and stick with it already puts his arguments in troubled waters. Considering a video on Big Think is often viewed as an opportunity to reach out to new people, all this does is make Peterson look plain sloppy and unprepared, rather than a well thought out thinker. But this isn't the only time Peterson throws out terms without thinking. Peterson seems to have the urge to throw out phrases he's picked up throughout the years without actually considering how they interact with one another. The result of this can be a complete mismatch where what he's saying just melts into a puddle of obscurity, like in this lovely segment.
The French intellectuals in particular just pulled off a sleight of hand and transformed Marxism into postmodern identity politics. And we've seen the consequence of that. It's not good. It's a devolution into a kind of tribalism that will tear us apart on the right and on the left and on the right.
So we have two phrases being given out side by side: identity politics and tribalism. What do these mean and how do they interact with one another? Well, identity politics, as far as I can tell, refers to one's position on policies being informed by the labels they identify with, whether it be on an individual or group level. This in turn can be used to form a unified front with others of similar labels to increase that group's ability to negotiate with other groups. Think of it like social unionization, giving the individually powerless a say in politics. Do note that the last aspect is something that can happen, but isn't necessary for identity politics to take place. A person voting for a candidate on the basis that they promise to put in place policy that appeals to their identity, whilst a purely individualistic act, could still be classed as a form of identity politics. Identity politics is often propped up against classical party politics. Due to the way both the US and the UK political systems operate, we've seen the formation of two major parties. Now traditionally, if you were predominantly left-wing, then you'd vote Democrat or Labour, whilst if you were predominantly right-wing, you'd vote Republican or Conservative. The problem is that this doesn't allow for a lot of party accountability, since people end up voting just to stop the other party, rather than actually voting on the basis of policy. Identity politics has been a shift away from that, to assess the individual policies on their merit, rather than on the basis of who forwarded them. This gives back some of that power, however little it may be, from a otherwise democratically choked system. So if that's identity politics, what about tribalism? Well, tribalism refers to group loyalty carrying connotations of being blind loyalty when used in a political sense. So political tribalism is defending the in-group at whatever cost, no matter what they say or do. So how does said tribalism reflect on identity politics? Well, it doesn't. The shift away from party politics to identity politics is a move away from tribalism, since no longer are people accused of identity politics defending Democrat because they are Democrat, something seen very plainly this last election cycle. What's often termed as the left eating itself is actually something known as internal discourse and accountability. Now, some may say that the labels of identity form part of a tribe and therefore identity politics may also be classed as a form of tribalism. The problem with that is intersectionality. Whilst a person can only belong to a single party, that very same person will have numerous labels, aspects to their identity which all interact with one another. And this is something that Peterson knows and will go on to discuss towards the end of his video. But more on that later. What the takeaway here is the fact that if you belong to a vast number of labels, you can't be said to have a blind tribalistic loyalty to any one label. You're going to have to consider the in-depth implications of each policy with each aspect of your person, making the notion of tribalistic identity politics nothing short of an oxymoron. In moving on to what may be considered the central point, the fatal flaw itself in Peterson's video, we have this.
On the right, I think we've identified markers for people who've gone too far in their ideological presuppositions. And it looks to me like the marker we've identified is racial superiority. And I think we've known that probably since the end of World War II, but we saw a pretty good example of it in the 1960s with William Buckley. Because Buckley, when he put out his conservative magazine, the David Duke types kind of attached themselves to it. And he said, no, here's the boundary. You guys are on the wrong side of the boundary. I'm not with you. And Ben Shapiro recently did this, for example, as well, in the aftermath of the Charlottesville incident. So what's interesting is that on the conservative side of the spectrum, we've figured out how to box in the radicals and say, no, you're outside the domain of acceptable opinion. Now, here's the issue. We know that things can go too far on the right. And we know that things can go too far on the left. But we don't know what the markers are for going too far on the left. And I would say that it's ethically incumbent on those who are liberal or left-leaning to identify the markers of pathological extremism on the left and to distinguish themselves from the people who hold those pathological viewpoints. And I don't see that that's being done. And I think that's a colossal ethical failure, and it may doom the liberal left project. But it is definitely the case that you can go too far on the left, and it's definitely the case that we don't know where to draw the line. And that's a big problem.
Now, the irony of this comes in the examples of extremism that Peterson led with when introducing the segments just played, where he discussed art painted under both the Nazi and Soviet regime.
Like in my house, I have a very large collection of socialist realist paintings from the former Soviet Union. Propaganda pieces, but also kind of harsh impressionist pieces of working class people and so forth. And I collected them for a variety of reasons. Now, you could debate about the propriety of that given the murderousness of those regimes. And fair enough, I have my reasons. But I don't have paintings from the Nazi era in my house. And I wouldn't. And that's been a puzzlement to me because I regard the totalitarian communist regimes as just as murderous as the Nazi regimes. But there's an evil associated with the Nazi regime that seems more palpable in some sense.
So in opening his points that the left has failed to identify the unethical extreme, Peterson introduces what many people on the left openly consider to be the unethical extreme. Peterson asserts that since he has several pieces from painters who'd lived and worked under Soviet rule, something he said he would not do with any Nazi-era piece, that this must mean the left has failed in doing what he believes the right has achieved. For a start, Peterson is right-wing, so how his personal taste in art reflects on the left is something needing explanation. Then we have the fact that painting under Soviet or Nazi rule does not necessitate support for either group. Under both Nazi and Soviet rule, ideas of degenerate art which strayed outside the norms of what was considered to be real art, began to emerge, with many pieces being destroyed and artists being punished for working outside the official style. Yet in looking at social realism versus Nazi art, I began to notice something. Whilst there are plenty of socialist realism pieces containing Soviet iconography such as flags, there are also a number of pieces which lack any such clear connotation. Socialist realism seems to be a little more toned back in many pieces, having a clear understanding of, dare I say it, the art of subtlety in simply depicting people at work. There's no flags, no hammer and sickle, it's just people working. How pieces such as young steel workers are received compared to, say, this Nazi representation of a blacksmith may be the result of the differences in iconography. In turn, this can perhaps help us understand why one is more likely to be purchased and hung on a wall, since one has given meaning through the presence of Nazi iconography, whilst the other is more open to interpretation, being not too distant from other pieces such as A Day in the Life of a Young Sheffield Steelworker. But I feel this is ultimately irrelevant. The left is not trying to impose socialist realism as the only form of art in America. The left is not attempting to erect statues to Stalin in public places and resorting to violence when that's challenged. The left has no desire to put in place and defend the presence of statues making heroes of genocide air. That is a behaviour almost entirely reserved for the American right. Hell, this was one of the central rallying cries for the Unite the Right movement, angry that statues of pro-genocide and pro-slavery figures were being removed. This is even though said statues were a relatively new addition to the public sphere, having exploded in number around the time of the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s as a state-sanctioned fuck you. The fatal flaw in Peterson's own argument, however, is the fact that it's based off one key assumption. Peterson assumes that if the left doesn't have to waste as much time tackling extremist groups as the right, that this must be the result of some sort of failure on the left. He's essentially asserting that since people can take left-wing politics too far, as seen with the right, a perfectly reasonable statement in of itself that nobody's likely to disagree with, that this must mean levels of extremism on the left should be the same as those on the right. Therefore, if the left doesn't have to act on the issue as often as the right, that's a failure on the left. Yet none of this stands to any sort of scrutiny. Peterson forgets to consider that maybe the reason the left doesn't have to deal with said extremism as frequently is the fact that reflective left-wing politics doesn't really allow for said radical groups to emerge as they do on the right with as much power and notoriety. Left-wing policies have historically focused on preventative rather than palliative cure. Is it possible that when it comes to extremism, we see the same thing? So the left has taken a preventative approach to decrease the prevalence of radicalization, whilst the right, all they do is very begrudgingly, after much poking, sometimes offer a watery statement of disassociation. I can list various Nazi and KKK groups, networking with one another and using supposedly moderate right-wing speakers such as Peterson himself as a way to recruit others into said extremism. The only group on the left I can personally think of as perhaps coming close to these are the TERFs, that's Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. Now these transphobic pseudo-feminists exist in both the US and the UK, having roots back to the very first Christopher Street Liberation Day marches in New York, and indeed even before then. And whilst I challenge their usage of the word feminism to describe themselves, I do not deny the vast majority of said people are left-wing authoritarian. I say left-wing authoritarian since they seek to strip back and further deny the rights of trans people, effectively attempting to legislate them out of existence. And thankfully, the left in general has fought back, most spectacularly in the UK with the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn refusing to give in to such vile narratives. Of course, there are pockets of resistance on the left, something that comes about with the political spectrum being so diverse in spite of Peterson's wishes to homogenise it. But generally, people on the left are or are starting to say no to transphobic bigotry, something which has resulted in some interesting implications. Namely, these radical left-wing groups have flocked to right-wing sources such as the Daily Mail as a platform from which to launch their attacks. On top of this, Women's Place UK, a transphobic hate group leeching off an actual charity, recently welcomed nationalist Paul Morgan, even though Paul Morgan publicly believes feminism is responsible for the destruction of Europe. Key figures such as the self-titled Dr. Radfem, aka Venice Allen, have cozied up to Conservative MPs such as Davy Davies due to their stance on trans people. Venice Allen was expelled from the Labour Party after she, a woman in her mid-40s, set about first harassing and then stalking a teenage MP. What's interesting is the way in which Allen promotes Davies, thanking him for, quote, standing up for lesbians, end quote. The irony of which is shown when one realises that Davies has historically voted against marriage equality at every vote on the matter he attended. And whilst I'm talking about TERFs in the UK, we must note that the emergence of the current climate came about following US bathroom bills and the online discourse. This happens in the US as well, which is why nationalist blogs like Breitbart have taken a key interest. What, if not an absence of power forced upon said radical left groups, could in fact force said radical leftists to make bedfellows not simply with the right, but segments of the right which have historically sought to deny them their own rights. Now, I'm not under the illusion that this is a perfect system. Certain more central groups don't seem to want to do much of anything, but there is some visible accountability. Can you show me groups forwarding Stalinism or Maoism in the UK and the US to the same degree as I can show you members of the KKK and Nazis in the same places? No? So moving on, now that we have discussed the left, it is time for us to discuss Peterson's claims that the right has succeeded in boxing in Nazis.
So, on the right, I think we've identified markers for people who've gone too far in their ideological presuppositions. And it looks to me like the marker we've identified is racial superiority. And I think we've known that probably since the end of World War II, but we saw a pretty good example of it in the 1960s with William Buckley. Because Buckley, when he put out his conservative magazine, the David Duke types kind of attached themselves to it. And he said, no, here's the boundary. You guys are on the wrong side of the boundary. I'm not with you. And Ben Shapiro recently did this, for example, as well, in the aftermath of the Charlottesville incident. So what's interesting is that on the conservative side of the spectrum, we've figured out how to box in the radicals and say, no, you're outside the domain of acceptable opinion.
Now I'm going to be generous here, since I'm not going to broaden the earlier example Peterson used of the Nazis to include all forms of racial superiority. I'm going to keep the focus on the Nazis, so those who support the ideology which resulted in the industrialized genocide of millions of Europeans during the last century. How does Peterson fare in boxing in said Nazis?
I have a book by Solzhenitsyn I'd like to get to. Thank you. It's 200 years together. Last year a couple started translating it into English and they put it online. I included all the chapters that they've translated so far. As a Jewish American, I think this book is very important for everyone to read. In the book, Solzhenitsyn documents the overrepresentation of Jewish individuals in the NKVD and in Bolshevik leadership. He claims that the ethnic hatred these individuals had for Christians played a role in the Holodomor. Jewish individuals had faced persecution in Ukraine prior to the Bolsheviks' rise to power. These individuals exacted their revenge on the Christian Ukrainian population. The result was the death of 4 million Christians. The line of good and evil cuts through the heart of every human. One cannot simply say a given ethnic group is evil. Every individual must struggle with the good and the evil in their own hearts. That being said, it is important to understand what motivates groups to commit atrocities against other groups, because the previous century has been filled with groups killing other groups. Like the Bolsheviks, Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing. I've got a question. It'll take 1 second. So just like the Bolsheviks, Jewish individuals are overrepresented in the ownership and senior staffing of the U.S. news media. The news media also is inexplicably hostile towards Russia. If the current warmongering against Russian Christians is in any way motivated by the same ethnic hatred that motivated the Holodomor, we must face that truth honestly. So here's my question. If Jewish individuals hated Christian Ukrainians enough to starve millions of them to death, could the same thing happen today? Could Jewish individuals use their position of power to seek out revenge against places like Europe and Russia that have a history of expelling Jews? Thank you again for your work. Just remember Rule 9, it's like... Maybe there's something here that you don't know about, And I am trying to just speak the truth. Okay. It's so difficult to disentangle. First of all, I haven't read this book, and I do want to read the book. So thank you for giving me the book. You're welcome. I can't do it. That's okay. Thank you very much for your work. You really have changed my life. You changed the life of a lot of people. Thank you so much.
So maybe some people are going to say I'm being a little unreasonable here. It's a hard question and Peterson was put on the spot. Maybe this was his first time he'd been asked said question.
Do you think I publicly disassociate yourself enough with my neo-Nazi followers that that use your work as justification for violence and propaganda? Well, what kind of question is that? First of all, you're making the unwarranted assumption that I definitely have neo-Nazi followers, and that they use my work as a justification, and that they're engaged in violence and propaganda. It's like, how about a specific example? Or how about 10 specific examples? I already pointed out that, imagine that, so 30 million people have watched my videos. So and 500,000 of them are YouTube subscribers. So let's say I have 500,000 followers, just for the sake of argument. Okay, like 1,000 of them are going to be completely out of their minds, because that's 1 in 500. So what does that prove? you'd have to demonstrate that there's a higher rate than average of pathology among the people who claim in some manner to be my followers. You have to do that because, as I said, everyone who's to the right of the radical left is a group, and in that group there's going to be people on the far right. That doesn't mean everyone in the group of non-radical leftists is a radical right-winger, obviously. So anyways, I think that that's a loaded question. I think it's loaded in a bunch of ways. Do you think you publicly dissociate yourself enough? Well, that's a loaded question, because the implication is that I don't publicly dissociate myself enough. Then the next implication is that I have more neo-Nazi followers than a random person with 500,000 followers would have. And then the next loaded bit is that they use my work as justification. I'd like to see that happen, because I can't see how it can possibly be used as justification, and that they use it as a justification for both propaganda and violence. It's like, really? Come on.
So rather than actually address the question he was asked in the comfort of his own home back in 2017, Peterson sets about denying the takeaway for many people who exist outside his fandom. I find the claim that without a study nobody can question whether he's doing enough to disassociate himself from various far-right groups before then going on big thing to claim that the left, and this is key, without any sort of study showing that they have higher rates of radicalization than the right, has somehow failed where the right has succeeded. So apparently Peterson can talk about his general perception of the left, yet nobody may dare challenge him on the same ground. The fact is this: you don't need a study to discuss every issue in life. Yes, studies are great in helping us to best inform our views, but the fact is we don't have the capacity to run studies on every aspect to life. But I will note that the level of bureaucracy Peterson is calling for here will become even more disturbing later down the line when he discusses his problems with equity. But keeping it on segment, Peterson must realise his own double standard to some degree. Also, even if it's a vocal minority of Peterson's fans who are Nazis and are being pushed to the front of discourse, I must ask, who's doing the pushing? Peterson himself has shared content airing his approval, not realising that the creators of said content routinely called for genocide. Thankfully, said account was terminated, yet the support Peterson had for said person remains part of his history to this day. So Peterson has not only failed to disassociate from Nazis, he has actively promoted Nazis, a fact not undone by a half-assed disclaimer on the side of his page. I also have to note the fact that verbally disassociating is not enough. If you, a content producer, find yourself repeatedly attracting people of certain ideologies, then it's on you to reflect on that and put in place measures to combat said issue. Even if you believe yourself to be offering some great service to humanity and these people to be a negative side product, waste management is still on you. Nuclear energy produces a lot of benefit, yet if those behind said industry just ignored the radioactive side products and left it undealt with, there would be an issue. The same is true for people in positions of influence. Yes, I understand the fact that there's a decoder to every message, and no matter what, there will likely always be such people clinging to some aspect of what you say. But there are still reasonable expectations of you. Don't just have a generic disclaimer on the side of your page. Actively challenge the ways in which these people have, according to you, taken your work in the wrong fashion. Don't start responding to their questions by anything but disdain. And then later, if you want, eviscerate the core point that they're forwarding. But first of all, you have to go all out in telling that person that their views are heinous, where they've sourced it from is heinous, and it's a disgrace upon humanity. Then you can show them why they are wrong. I'm saying this because you have responded to said question in both your home setting with the Q&A I showed earlier, as well as more recently with an update video. But that's not enough. You are giving them power. You are saying that this is a position worth debating, and that just gives them legitimacy. You are legitimizing the views of Nazis. My videos on Islam attract one or two Islamophobes now and then, and yes, I'm using the word correctly since it has real application. I see said people generally just hate brown people, the perceived Middle Eastern other, and come to my videos looking for support. First I respond to them with open hostility, then I hide their thread from public eye so they can see my response to their rampant racism, but they're not given the opportunity to recruit. I'm not legitimizing them. Now I'm not saying that you have to respond in the way I respond, but at least stop giving Nazis a boost in traffic. Your actions speak far louder than your words. Whilst Peterson spent a long time listing examples of terrible left-wing ideologies abandoned by virtually everyone on the left before claiming the left had no standards, Peterson also had some suggestions of his own for what should constitute for radical leftism.
I've suggested that there's a triumvirate of concepts that bear the same, have the same potentially catastrophic outcomes when implemented as the racial superiority doctrines. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity as a triumvirate, even though you can have an intelligent conversation about two of those anyways. But I would say that of the three, equity is the most unacceptable, the doctrine of equality of outcome. And it seems to me that that's where people who are thoughtful on the left should draw the line. Say, no, equality of opportunity, not only fair enough, but laudable. But equality of outcome, it's like, nope, you've crossed the line. We're not going there with you.
So to be clear, on the right we have racial superiority often working towards slavery or genocide. On the left we have accounting for numerous social barriers that occur throughout life. Apparently these things are of some equal in the eyes of Jordan Peterson. That right there should tell you how little Peterson understands about the topic of morality and indeed many of the topics he touches upon. Either that or Peterson knows that Stalinism is not popular on the left like Nazi fascism is on the right, so he's fully aware that to continue using his earlier comparison would result in an easy refutation. Therefore it's better to go all in and draw a false comparison for two things that aren't even close. Contrary to Peterson's statements, equity is not equality of outcome. Equity simply notes that even if people are given the exact same opportunity to begin with, social inequality has a persistent impact. The best way to describe this is with long distance running on a circular track. Equality is everyone starting out side by side, which intuitively seems to be the right thing, and for short distance running, it is. But the same is not true for long distance, and why comes out in the existence of the turns in the track. The amount of distance the runner on the outside has to cover is far more than the runner on the centre. Equity comes along, notes this, and sets to put in place policy to make the race fair. That is why we stagger our long distance runners. Now these corners are analogous to so many things, from house ownership to promotion. Certain groups have to put in so much extra work to achieve what others achieve on very little work that the equal start turns out to be less equal in the long run. But do note, equity is not the solution and was never intended to be so, but is simply a stand-in for the moment. Dismantling the systems that allow for said discrimination is the end goal, which is akin to having one straight track for any race, at which point, yes, equity becomes redundant. But this will take time, and until that point, equity helps us pursue true fairness in the system. So what example does Peterson use to highlight his issue?
Well, an example of equality of outcome is attempts being made now to implement the legislative necessity to eliminate the gender pay gap. That's a good example. I mean, you think, well, no, that's not, like, there's nothing pathological about that. It's like, oh yes, there is. You have to set up a bureaucratic inquisition to ensure that that's the case. It's like, it's not good. And that's actually a relatively, like, of all the things that you could push for with regards to equality of outcome, that's rather simple and definable. It's not even murky. Once it starts to get murky, it's just complex beyond any rectification.
Women are paid less simply on the basis of their perceived gender, with a further gap being the result of social demands surrounding childbirth and childcare. The first part is outright unethical and illegal, yet still continues, and we should do everything we can to tackle that. A 2018 report put the difference based on gender alone, so accounting for all other factors, at around 7% 1 year after graduation, a percentage that increased to 12% over the next 10 years. Now this increase is why equity is required, since inequality is not just something that impacts a person as they start out in life. It's a compounding issue that grows over time. And yet we shouldn't lose sight of the other 8% or the 20% total, simply because it's the result of secondary factors. Discrimination does not have to be direct. The other 8% is the result of a mixture of social factors, including gender-segregated occupation, open hostility towards women not wanting children, and open hostility towards working mothers. One survey found that, quote, about 3/4 of adults, 74%, say the increasing number of women working for pay has made it hard for parents to raise children, and half say that it has made marriages harder to succeed, end quote. This sort of perception can lead to a great deal of social anxiety, already seen in many parents, something that we must understand impacts our choices for less than valid reasons. This needs to be rigorously challenged, something that will take time and, sadly, isn't helped by people who don't want to understand the issue in detail, but instead want to throw out the wage gap as if it's been dealt with, when it really hasn't. I should also note, I find it somewhat hypocritical of Peterson, who refuses to even entertain a genuine question about his actions or inactions without a peer-reviewed study, only to then complain about bureaucracy as if it's a terrible thing. Yet I feel this exposes the core truth behind Peterson. He does nothing more than peddle easy answers for simple people. So in drawing back to the start of my response, I must mention my earlier discussion on intersectionality and how it completely invalidated Peterson's claims that identity politics is tribal in nature, a fact I stated Peterson is very aware of. Here is the basis for that statement.
Let's push for equality of outcome. All right, who measures it? That's a big problem. It's not a little problem. It's not like we'll figure that out later. Oh, no, no, no. The measurement problem is paramount. So you don't solve that, you don't solve the problem at all. Who measures it? A bureaucracy. Okay, which bureaucracy? Well, a large one that has its fingers everywhere. Okay, that's problem number one. And it's staffed by exactly the sort of people that you don't want to staff it, by the way. Next problem. Which identities? That's the intersectional problem, right? The radical leftists have already hit the problem of intersectionality. It's like, well, we've got race and gender, let's say. Well, okay, what about the intersection between race and gender? That's a multiplicative intersection, right? So you might start with 3 racial categories and 2 gender categories, but you end up with 6 intersectional categories. And then you're just getting started. How many genders? Hypothetically, there's an infinite number. What about racial groupings? You're going to include ethnicity? You want to add class to that? You want to add socioeconomic class? How about attractiveness? And every time you add another category to the singular entities, you increase the multiplicative entities in a multiplicative fashion. What are you going to do? You're going to equate across all those categories? Really? And across what dimensions? What are the dimensions of equality that you want to establish? It's just socioeconomic. Is it just salary? What about all the other ways that people are unequal? You're going to just stop with economic inequality, are you? It's like, it's a complete bloody catastrophe. It's an absolute mess. And intersectionality, the discovery of intersectionality on the left is actually the radical left's discovery of the fundamental flaw in their identity politics ideology. Groups can be multiplied without limit. Okay, that's not a problem. That's a fatal flaw. And they've already discovered it. They just haven't figured it out.
Now, besides refuting his earlier statements about the left and its apparent tribalistic nature, I need to be absolutely clear about something. Reality doesn't owe you or anybody easy answers. Peterson's basis here is one I've seen argued by religious apologists time and time again, that the truth is difficult to comprehend as seen with evolutionary science, or may require some actual thought and participation as with secular ethics. But something being difficult does not invalidate said principle. It's also incredibly dishonest of you to demand that people respond to you with detailed frameworks in casual discussion. That is not how science works. You're right, it is a bureaucratic nightmare, but it only needs to exist due to the nightmarish inequality you benefit from. It's easy for you to say, this is hard, let's party. It's not your pay that is effectively being cut each week. It's not your children being executed in the streets by police. It's not your future that is being destroyed by the resurgence of Nazi fascism. Fact is, the arguments you are making now could very easily be used in medicine as well. If you have a friend or family member who suffers chronic health conditions, especially the elderly, then you will likely know just how quickly medications can add up. Now, these medications don't do their own thing. They mix, they interact, and they can wreak havoc on a person's life. It gets to the point where in the end, half of the medications a person takes are to counteract the side effects of the cocktail formed by the other half that actually resolves the original medical issue. Does that mean we should just stop giving them medication because it's complicated? No. These are people's futures, and their children's futures, and their grandchildren's futures, and so on. These are human beings who are worth struggling to support. Not because we can obtain some monetary gain from them, but because they are human beings deserving of that respect. The system in place is not perfect, but they are better than nothing, and they're only meant to be temporary. Let me put it to you this way. The sooner you can convince what is primarily the right to stop discriminating, the sooner we can do away with said systems. What you call the fatal flaw on the left, I simply see as the fatal flaw in the mirage of your persona. You're little more than the political equivalent of Zakir Naik or William Lane Craig. Easy answers for simple people, no matter the inaccuracy of what you're preaching. Rather ironically, considering his earlier accusations, Peterson's entire premise in his video is tribalistic in nature. He can't admit that maybe, just maybe, the right could learn something from the left in looking at its preventative measures in tackling extremism. He can't do this. Instead, he has to present the results of said preventative measures as a fatal flaw. Why? Because he needs to present said preventative measures as evil in order to forward the right-wing palliative response as good. If he fails to do this, then he risks the question being asked, why do people on the right need to disassociate themselves from groups such as Nazis so often? It's an uncomfortable position to be in, and it means Peterson can give no quarter in presenting the left as some homogeneous evil entity.
But I mean, like, it's not like I'm making this up, you know.
Keep telling yourself that, Mr. Peterson. Hi there. I just want to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Alexander Williams, and Daniel Martinez. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years, and for that we are truly thankful. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe and follow EssenceOfThought on Facebook and Twitter. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, an organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Do note, any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability, both mental and physical, will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's keep this space one which upholds the humanist values. Thank you for watching.